larger than brains of men from other races. And it's an example of actual mismeasurement at the observational stage and the use of science to support social causes. Some people see some of the fairly sloppy work in brain lateralization research going on now as the 20th century equivalent of that. There's some good research in that area, but some of it is very sloppy and extrapolation beyond what the data warrant, and from split brain patients to SAT scores and other bizarre things like that. Right-handed, left-hand, all that stuff. The other area that's very easy to point out, and which most students are aware of, is the 19th century perversion of Darwin's theories into social Darwinism, which was used to support a certain class structure and agenda, and to suggest that rich people were rich because they were survival of the fittest kind of thing. And many people see some aspects, again, of sociobiology. Again, there's some good sociobiology research, but there's some sociobiology research that is not very good, that extrapolates inappropriately from data on insects to human beings, talks about raping ducks, and therefore provides rationale for raping in men. And so that kind of thing is the 20th century equivalent. I think that although we as scientists often are aware of the flaws in this research and tend to think it's not even worth addressing when it's being misused for political causes like this, this is not so much the case for our students. Many of them are aware of this, and particularly for women students and students of color who tend to be the brunt of this misuse of research. It's very important that we discuss this in class and point out where the flaws are. And I think an important argument for convincing women and men of color to become scientists is so that they can point out the flaws on scientific grounds on how this research is not done appropriately. Finally, I would suggest under theories and conclusion, is drawn from the data to encourage development of theories and hypotheses that are relational, interdependent, and multi-causal, rather than hierarchical, reductionistic, and dualistic. I think it's important to look at females' interest in relationships and interactions among factors when designing experiments. One laboratory instructor expressed the situation in the following way: the boys won't listen to the instructions. They can't wait to play with the equipment. The girls always want more information about what they're doing and how it relates to other topics we've already studied. Now I'd like to close with a few comments about the practice of science, because I think these are also important for students. A first issue here is to consider the use of less competitive models in practicing science. There's a good body of research suggesting that although many women like to be competitive, they do not necessarily like to be competitive at the expense of someone else. They like to do well and maybe compete against themselves, but not I win, you lose kinds of situations. So the classic setup of mathematics, go to the blackboard and see who completes the problem first, may not be such a turn-on for many women. It also may not be a turn-on for male students from certain cultures, such as American Indian cultures, where to stand out from the group is not encouraged. And that's also true in certain types of African American cultures, where the teamwork is important rather than one individual winning at the expense of other individuals. Some of the collaborative work that is now, and group work that is now being encouraged in all areas, actually, but particularly in science, can be very useful for women. Although one of the things that I see happening with some of that is that faculty are not sufficiently aware of information on race and gender, so that they just sort of get the idea from attending a professional meeting or skimming a journal that group work is where it's at now in science. And so they think, okay, I'm going to do this group work in my class. And so they'll set up some situations that in fact may be more harmful to women and to men of color, who may be the groups precisely they were hoping that this would be helpful to. What I'm thinking of here is, for example, if you have a physics class that has 5 females and 20 males, which is not at all uncommon in many universities for a gender ratio in a physics class, if you get that many females, that a lot of faculty will think, great, I could have 5 groups of 5 each, I'll put 1 woman in each group, gender equity, right? Well, that is probably not the best way to arrange things. We know from the work of Richard Light at Harvard that when you tend to have one female in a group, particularly in science and mathematics, she tends to drop out. Or from Treisman's work that if you have one student of color, African American male, for example, in a group of all white males, he tends to drop out. So it's probably better in that group that we're describing to have maybe one group that has 2 females, one group that has 3 females, even if that means you have 3 groups that are all male. And there's some other issues surrounding that too, that people really need to know a little bit about cultural situations and some ethnic sensitivity. For example, and there are always exceptions to this, and it's somewhat difficult to even talk about it without sounding like stereotyping, but it might put many Hispanic women in a difficult situation to make them a leader of a group of, say, 2 white men and 2 Asian American men. That would probably be a difficult situation for that Hispanic woman in a science class, although there are certainly individuals who would have no trouble with that. Another issue that comes up somewhat related to this is the topic of critical mass. We know originally from the work of Rosabeth Moss Kanter that was done with corporations and from a variety of other studies that there's this whole behavior known as tokenism behavior, which occurs when people are in the vast minority in a group. So this would happen to, women in some science classes, to racial minorities, perhaps to men in women's studies classes. What this amounts to is that the individuals end up behaving in the way that the dominant group expects them to behave. Now, they had some experience with this at MIT when they went from having about 3 or 4% female students to having almost 40% female students, which is what they have now. And they found that at first, the female students were not performing as well as they expected by the formula they used for predictions. And the provost told me actually that what they did was drop out the verbal portion of the SAT, was how they got their formula. But anyway, they found that was very successful for the male students. For the female students, that was not as successful at first until they started to do a number of things. And one of the things they had to do was they found that females had not had very much experience with circuit boards. So they set up some peer counseling situations that gave the women experience working on circuit boards. This is the whole equipment hands-on issue. Second thing they found was the females did not have access to the exam files in the fraternities. And I'm not quite sure how they remedied that. But a third thing that they found was very important was a critical mass of students in any classroom. That as long as women were below critical mass, which is usually considered to be somewhere between 15 and 30%, they did not perform as well as expected. That once they got above critical mass, they performed as well or better than expected by the formula. So that does present a problem for some areas where we're still not at all approaching critical mass in certain areas of the sciences. And there's a whole issue about how to handle that. Second thing under practice of science is that I think it's important to discuss the role of scientists as only one facet that has to be smoothly integrated with other aspects of students' lives. As I mentioned in that Illinois valedictory study, this comes up over and over about women dropping out of science because they don't perceive having a career in science as compatible. Some people put it with as having a life, but as with having relationships and or children. And I think it's very important that we show our students a variety of role models of women who have children, women who are straight, women who are lesbians, women who are married, women who are single mothers, women who are all kinds of things. So they see there's not just one kind of woman who becomes a scientist. Women's colleges, are very successful in producing scientists. They produce by far a much larger proportion of women scientists than either co-ed private colleges, which produce more than public universities. And certainly there are a lot of things going on at women's colleges, but one of the things that goes on there is that there are role models on the faculty. They typically try to keep their faculties about 50-50. and that's a big issue. So to get more women in faculty positions, in senior faculty positions, often just one woman in a department, I mean, that's a start, but one woman is almost as problematic as no women, in that then all the students feel, oh, this is what a woman chemist looks like, and if they don't look like or act like or want to be just like that one woman, then they're thinking, oh, well, I guess I can't be a chemist or a physicist or whatever it is. So I think it's very important that we provide our students with a variety of role models, sometimes bringing in people from professional societies. Something else that I would like to mention in terms, I guess, of role modeling is the fact that many of us who are faculty now were taught by faculty who employed what I call weed 'em out teaching techniques. For example, I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We were given the spiel: look to your left, look to your right, look in front of you, look in back of you. One of the 5 of you will be here at the end. Now, I question whether that was ever a good pedagogical technique, but it's certainly not a good technique when you're trying to attract students to science. But it took me a while to realize that I had modeled many of my teaching behaviors after my own faculty members, because as a traditional scientist, of course, I had had no education courses or anything like that. And I was modeling after people who were trying to get rid of 75 to 80% of the people in the class. And so I began to think about to what extent I had either consciously or subconsciously modeled some of their teaching behaviors that might in fact be very negative for students and send messages I was not intending to send, but that was, the way I had learned to teach this concept, by observing Professor so-and-so, who had also as a secondary agenda get rid of 3/4 of the people. And so I think that's something we really need to think about, and it ties in with some of these other issues surrounding language and so on. Finally, I would like to emphasize discussing the practical uses to which scientific discoveries are put to help students see science in its social context. We may need to think about restructuring the curriculum to include more information on communication skills, ethics, and aesthetics. A survey of engineering seniors that was conducted at Purdue uncovered that female students were more apt than male students to give greater importance to educational goals that stress general education, communication skills, and the development of high ethical standards. Both males and females perceived that those were not in the curriculum. The difference was it didn't matter to the male students, whereas the female engineering majors felt dissatisfied with their engineering degree and questioned whether they might not have should have taken another major, or why they didn't get more on these ethics and aesthetics. Similar information shows up in some limited cross-cultural data. For example, in a study of differential attitudes between boys and girls towards physics in Europe, Lee and Brinney gave the following summary of their results. Taken together, we may say that the girls' interests are characterized by a close connection of science to the human being, to society, and to ethic and aesthetic aspects. Boys are particularly more than girls interested in the technical aspects of science. So in closing, I would say that ensuring that science and technology are presented in their social context with some focus on human beings may in fact be one of the important results that can come from thinking about how we might change the teaching of science to make it more attractive to women and to men of color. As you'll notice, what I've tried to do tonight is to focus a little bit more on that. For quite a few years, we dealt with what I called the deficit model, which is what was wrong with women and with men from various ethnic groups that we weren't attracted to science. Maybe we needed to get more visuospatial ability. Maybe we needed to get more competitive. We had to take these problem-solving workshops, assertiveness training, all these kinds of things were suggested, dress for success. The focus for a while used to be on what's wrong with these groups that they don't want to become scientists. Now we're beginning to look at something else that's also very interesting. What's wrong with science and science teaching that it's not attracting people from these groups? And I think that this raises some fruitful and interesting questions. Of course, the final goal, in my opinion, of attracting more diversity to the pool of scientists, as I suggested earlier, is that ultimately I think that this will make for a better science. As you'll recall, in the scientific method, there's that part where you hold up the hypothesis at the end for sifting and winnowing. And theoretically, that's when any flaws or biases that have entered are supposed to be removed. But if all the people doing that sifting and winnowing come from a relatively homogeneous perspective, that is to say, white, middle class, and male, and there's nothing wrong with being white, middle class, and male. What's wrong is if that's all the people you have in the pool of scientists, they're not going to see any biases or flaws that have entered because they come from a group of people who have a relatively similar background and set of experiences. So for me, this is the bottom line of why it's important to get more diversity in the pool of scientists, because I think it will make for a better science. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions or take comments. Let me put my glasses on. I'm at this awkward age where I can't see some things if I have them on. I can't see other things if I have them on. Yes?
Could you be more specific about what teaching techniques you consider to have weeding out as an aim?
Well, I think sometimes when faculty say, you know, it is clear that, it is obvious that, and the student says, look, this is not clear and obvious to me, and the faculty member presents the, say, mathematics problem using exactly the same example, exactly the same terminology, with no attempt to think, you know, where would this student be coming from, you know, just, or short changes the students, is very haughty and abrupt, sometimes refuses to explain things, which, you know, I have seen happen in worst case scenarios where they just go, well, this should be clear to you. You know, you must not have done the work if you don't understand this explanation I gave. You know, that kind of thing, which clearly is going to be discouraging for certain students who really don't have it. There is some research showing that right now, most of the people who become scientists decided at age 4 or 5 they were going to be scientists, and that nothing would deter them. And they say, yes, they had bad teachers, bad books, bad experiences, but they didn't care. They were going to become a scientist no matter what. There seems to be a whole nother group of scientists, this would be like Sheila Tobias's second tier, who are probably equally capable of doing science, but who are affected by you know, bad teachers, bad books, negative messages. And there's some thought that more, or at least I think, and there's some evidence to back this up, that more women in particular would fall in this group because we're socialized to respond more to subtleties and negative messages, to body language, to the way something is said as well as exactly what's said, so that women and perhaps students from some other cultural backgrounds where those things are emphasized may be turned off by exactly the statement more than maybe a white male who's not socialized so much to pick up on those other cues. So that's why, you know, I try to emphasize that two people sitting in the same room may not hear the same thing the same way and you know, take it the same way. Yeah?
I know you're interested in science education, but I wonder if you could address yourself for a moment to education in the humanities. As I listen to it, it seems like what happens from your point of view is that a lot of women as freshmen leave the sciences and go to the humanities, and rather than seeing that as the sciences being unattractive, it might be that the humanities are attractive, especially for 18-year-olds who appreciate ambiguities.
Right, that's true.
And the humanities need this diversity as much as the sciences.
Sure.
So that if you look at it in a holistic way, that's not a bad result,
Oh,
that's a
no.
good result.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, and I don't try to discourage. I myself, as an undergraduate, had a dual major in French and zoology. I mean, I was very attracted to the humanities. And I think a lot of women feel this way. And, no, I think there's nothing wrong with that from the point of view. But also, I hate to see people who could be very interested in science who are turned off by bad teaching. And, who have some intrinsic interest in the subject but get turned off, and if there are things that we could be doing to turn them on. The other thing is a somewhat pragmatic thing. First of all, there's, I think, the importance in science, as I said, for having more diversity, which already exists somewhat in the humanities because you have a more diverse population of people doing it. Well, okay, but relative. I mean, if you look at the percentage of women in the humanities compared to the percentage of women in the sciences, I mean, there's just no comparison. The other thing, what was I going to say? I had another thing. Is that for women, to be frank, the staying in math and the getting scientific careers relatively is a financial advantage in our society. Pragmatically, it is a good thing to do. Although women scientists make less money than men scientists, just like women make less money than men, they still make more money than their counterparts on the average in the humanities and social sciences. So this tracking women away from the sciences, which sometimes occurs, can hurt them financially. And that's a serious issue. And if they don't take the 4 years of math, for example, in high school, many majors are automatically closed to them in college unless they're willing to go back and do so-called remedial mathematical work. And those tend to be majors that lead to more lucrative livelihoods. I mean, so that's another issue for some people. That's never, in my opinion, the major issue for why you have somebody go on in science, but it's an important issue. And that's often why men are not permitted to drop out of mathematics, even though they're doing worse. I mean, there's a whole body of research showing that boys have math anxiety too, but that the way parents, teachers, and so on respond to that is very differently in boys compared to girls. Girls are told, oh, okay, you can drop out, whereas boys are told something like, you're going to need that math, to continue and get a job, make a living. So, I mean, that's a real issue, too, this differential treatment and response. Yeah.
I'm one of those people who dropped out of the sciences and went into the humanities for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. I was tracked I was a Sputnik kid, and I scored very highly on science and math tests, and I was tracked in that way, and went to college and fully intended to become a scientist. I read books about Marie Curie and thought this was very interesting and wanted to do exciting things, and took all science courses when I first went to college, and it was so cut and dried. There was absolutely no context. There was there was a right answer, and I got good grades. I did fine in the classes. I took a philosophy course, and I thought, now this is interesting. I changed my major and became a philosophy and English major. And many years later, started to think I really might have wanted to be a marine biologist, but the way that science was taught and the way it just had no ambiguity, as you say. It had no resonance for me. It was just like it wasn't interesting. I could sit down and memorize these little charts of all these enzymes and hormones and all this stuff and get A's on the test, and it was like, so what? What difference does this make? What does this have to do with anything?
Right. And the thing is, that's not what science really is like at the higher. We're presenting a false impression. If that were what all of everyday science is like, then it would not be inaccurate. Mm-hmm. But that's how it comes across in the intro courses, particularly, and that's really not what it's like.
And
the creativity is lost.
That somewhere down the line, it could be very interesting to be a scientist, but I thought, geez, you got to go through
yeah, right.
boring classes to get there.
Right. There is some of that. Yes.
I guess in the hardest core of the physical sciences and physics. Simply I've noticed first, when you start getting into professional meetings, assertiveness becomes increasingly rewarding, that there's give and take, And especially now with an extraordinarily difficult job market, don't you feel it's going to become very difficult at the back end of all of this for women to sort of, who've actually made it through all of this, go on to actually professional careers within both research and educational institutions?
You mean, if, I'm not sure if I didn't hear quite the beginning of your question. I'm sorry, I was coughing. Did you say because they're not as assertive? Was that the idea?
Well, something I've heard mentioned, I'm wondering if the assertiveness that seems to be rewarded, and I guess perhaps it's stereotypically male, that seems to be very important right now within the professional meetings and in finding career opportunities. Do you feel that that is the case, and is it going to become, will it be a significant barrier for women coming into science at this point?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends, I think, what kind of career you're looking at. Some sorts of careers, they don't really like the super assertive outlook, particularly now in American business and industry. There is some recognition of a more consensual model and the idea that collaborative approaches are more effective. And as a matter of fact, from some of the engineering faculties I've worked with and heard some feedback from industry and stuff, an issue that arises is that in the group work, if you don't make people switch around and do various roles, what may happen, for example, in the engineering curriculum, particularly the last year and sometimes the last 2 years are almost entirely group projects, where each semester they do 3 or 4 projects. And it's possible to have the project get an A, but if the roles aren't switched around, people may not learn to do all facets of the project. So sometimes the way that works out in terms of gender is if the women have kind of done the group dynamics and kept things together, and a man, say, has done the equipment part, when they get out in the industry, they both get fired because if she hasn't learned to do the equipment, he hasn't learned to interact with people. They're both not going to do particularly well. There is some evidence that women in science do a little better. I mean, there's all this talk about, women getting hired preferentially because some places are looking for women. But I'm not talking about that in particular. What I'm talking about is that if women in science who have the scientific skills, but also tend to have the social skills, will often do quite well and move into more management type positions or interactive positions earlier. Now, at some point, there's also this glass ceiling that a lot of women hit that prevent them from going, say, to become the CEO or something. So it kind of depends what level you're talking about, I think, how that will work. And I don't know, I mean, the job thing is very hard to tell. A lot of that is short-term, long-term.
Becky Rosser, your analogy of the male in the kitchen was quite clear. Are there recent longitudinal studies that would support that young women's comfort levels in physical sciences particularly are increased if they have been exposed to hands-on physical sciences at early, like even primary grades?
Right. Yes, there are some studies definitely showing that. And there are studies showing, for example, that the best way to increase visuospatial ability, which is an issue for many women, is playing video games. But then you get into a chicken-egg thing because a lot of little girls don't like to play video games because the video games are very militaristic and kill them, defend it. And so there has been some talk about trying to set up video games that would be more attractive to little girls, but not many of those have appeared. For example, my own daughters were very interested in Ms. Pac-Man, but they were not very interested in most of the, where they, they had babies and the whole bit, I think we need some more of those kinds of experiences, but yes, definitely the hands-on things. Some of the women who are in engineering who are comfortable in hands-on, have expressed to me that they, I've known several who, for example, had brothers that they also took apart cars with or did that. Of course, the flip side that's also occurring is that a lot of engineering faculty are telling me that they now get some male students who have very little experience, in hands-on equipment. And so it may be a whole new component that has to be built into the curriculum anyway. But yeah, the equipment issue is a severe one. I used to, when I was a division chair at a women's college in Virginia, we would have meetings with the other division chairs, and some of them were from women's colleges and some from men's colleges and some from co-ed. And the women's colleges, we always had the lowest equipment breakage rate. The men's colleges had the highest, and the co-ed were up near the men's. I mean, it's nice for you as division chair, it saves your budget, but the bad news is that while the men are breaking the equipment, they're learning how to use it. You know, they play with it, they break it, but they're also, you know, feeling more comfortable with it, they're fooling around with it. The hardware issue is a big thing. There's recently been a big drop-off of women in computer science. I don't know if that has occurred here also, but nationally there's been quite a drop-off of women in computer science. And one thing a lot of the women tell me is that they're just not as interested in the hardware, and they do like to talk to people. They say, you know, like they're sick of these hacker guys. You know, you go to their apartments, 10 hack, you know, the guys will have 10 computers wired up, and they don't ever talk to each other. They only talk to each other through the computer. And the women are saying, I see you all have experiences. The women say, you know, we could do that, but we don't want to do that. We wanted to interact personally with people. And their question of becoming yeah, computer scientists because they feel they would have to interact with people like this all the time. Yeah. Yes, this one. Oh, Christopher.
If female students are taught by women teachers in the sciences, are they more likely to stay involved in sciences? And if so, is that going to turn off the males that are in science?
Well, it's very hard to get very good data on that because, as you know, at most institutions there are not too many women teachers, and many students, actually many women, have very few women teachers at the college level. It's certainly true at women's colleges that there's this production of many, many more women scientists than other colleges, even of comparable co-ed institutions, which are also private and of similar sizes. Now, there are a whole lot of things that go on at women's colleges, so it would be unfair to hang it all on the women teachers, but certainly one thing is the whole role model issue and everything. In terms of how the men students feel about that, it's very hard to say because most of them have not had exclusively female teachers on the college level. There is some evidence that female teachers get worse teaching evaluations than male teachers. Students on the whole, both male and female, expect teachers to be competent. In addition, they expect women faculty members to be nurturing. And sometimes those two things go at cross purposes. So, for example, a woman faculty member who gives a hard test, that's seen as competent but not nurturing. So, you know, this is something that administrators or department chairs or whoever evaluates or looks at teaching evaluation need to be aware of that nationally. You know, there have been studies showing that women faculty do get lower ratings. Students have, you might say, conflicting expectations for female faculty more than they do for male faculty. There's some data showing that students, both male and female, seek out female faculty members more often as mentors or advisors, either formally or informally. And that's true for male and female students. So that would suggest that male students actually like female faculty members, but again, a lot of this may be the nurturing thing. It was very complicated. But yeah.
You use the term men of color, and I don't think that's a very accurate term because
What does that mean to you? Yeah.
well, I think that everyone is a color, and not really that I am a person of color, yes.
Yeah.
And that's what I think what you mean, and I think a lot of others.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of debate about that. When you talk about white, you know, that's a race also. What I was saying was women, and I included women, white women and women of color in that term, but then I also wanted to say some men of color as distinguished from white men. But there's a lot of variation also among men of color who come from different ethnic groups. And in terms of science and everything, for example, in science, Asian American men are not underrepresented in science, nor are Asian American women, so they're not considered a minority for science. Whereas African American men and women, Hispanic American men and women, and American Indian men and women are. So it is very confusing. What term do you think would be better? Would you like to hear?
I really don't. I don't
It's
think
hard,
any
yeah.
term right now that's being used is really that accurate.
Exactly, I agree with you. It's hard. think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I would like to share my personal experience as a college student in Turkey in chemical engineering, where 50% of the students and 50% of faculty members were female, and still are. And after coming from such an experience to graduate school here, the issues of women in science sort of didn't mean anything to me because I really didn't understand what people were talking about. It was just a big deal about. And after staying here for a while and seeing the situation, I look back and see that I had a very positive experience, as I never felt inferior to the male counterpart in the classroom, and also we never regarded our female professors as incompetent, or we never expected them to be more nurturing than the male professors. And it was sort of the way of life, and some professors were nurturing, some professors were tough, and that didn't have anything to do with the gender. And in the same way, seeing the faculty members and the women teaching aspired us to go to graduate school, and we wanted to be like one of them, so it had a role model thing. But we never felt inferior because we were the same number of people, and the same number of women students were in the laboratory as male students, and it was mostly women who were doing the job and men taking the notes in certain situations. So I think
Maybe we should offer them to Turkey.
or just make sure that you have 50% of all the faculty members are female in the schools, and just I think we won't be talking about those kind of things when the population in the schools and the colleges become more representative of the whole population.
Right. I mean, clearly we have a gender issue because more than 50% of the students in college are women, but not, more than 50% in the sciences. And we have a gender stratified labor market in this country. I mean, a good way you can guess somebody's gender if you don't know it is to know their occupation. Just like if there were no gender issue, you'd expect 50% or 51% of scientists to be women, you'd expect 49% of elementary school teachers to be men. But it's really not that way. Maybe like one final question.
It's
Yes.
not really a question. I was just going to say that I took a chemistry class last summer, and I read a textbook written by a woman, and it was taught by a woman, and I always hated chemistry, and I would bawl incessantly. I just cried during high school chemistry because I hated it so much. And I took this class, and it was taught by a woman, and the textbook was written by a woman, and I learned it so easily. I mean, it came so fast that I was tutoring people as I was going. And I am now here, and I'm in a botany curriculum, and I love it, but I'm taking chemistry now, and it's a textbook written by a man, and it's a class taught by a man, and it's not really, it's harder by far, but I just wanted to know if you had any statistics about the textbooks versus the teachers, because I noticed that just the terminology is a lot easier to follow when a woman's explaining it. She explains it, I think, like it's not so much of a secret. This conspiracy of chemistry now, it's not a conspiracy. It's just information, and it's really cool. And it's like, and you read it, and you're like, I understand this. This is great. This answers questions that I've had. And then I get here, and I have total respect for my professor, but he just seems like it's more of a look around you, all these people are going to be dropped, and it's true, there are a lot of people dropped.
Right. Well, in terms of the textbook thing, I'm not sure most, of course, of the textbook authors, particularly on the college level, are male. But there is some work, and in fact, in my own NSF project back in South Carolina, one of the men who writes one of the major chemistry textbooks is in that, and he's going to be including more gender stuff and trying to get sensitive to these issues, and I think some people are. In terms of what you have to say about the women teaching and the women writing, It does get into a whole body of research that a lot of people in the humanities have done about different ways that men and women communicate, and it would not be too surprising that, you know, as a woman you would understand perhaps an explanation given by a woman maybe more easily in the sorts of examples. You share that experience, and that's certainly one of the reasons that science may seem more foreign for women, in that most of the people who have done it are men, and they explain it from the way they see things. There's also a body of research in the history and philosophy of science suggesting that some of this obfuscation and secretiveness has been developed in science and has become part of, you know, what was considered to be appropriately scientific. And there has been some, I know, I hate to get into these terms, deconstructing of that by people in other disciplines. So
It's a really interesting observation that you make. I mean, a very sophisticated one to say that it's a secret that somebody's keeping, and I think that gets into the heart of a lot of these diversity things. Do we really want a diverse academy? Do we really want diversity? Do we really want to have, you know, or do we want an elite club to which, you know, where we keep people out? And I think a lot of people who you know, give lip service to diversity don't entirely want to open that club up to you or to me. Or,
I think we should thank Dr. Rosser for a very enlightening speech, and I invite you to stay afterwards for some punch and cookies.